Okay, we're live.
Hello.
Hi everyone.
Hi.
Thank you so much for being here today. We are rejuvenating Sips with SITTI after a somewhat long hiatus. We spent a lot of time working on other projects the past year, but we're really excited to be back here and bringing a new episode of Sips with SITTI on a really exciting topic with an amazing guest. Today, we're starting a small mini series on discussing impact and SITTI's impact in particular, because we are launching our 2021-2022 impact report, which we're very excited about, and you'll be able to check that out on our website. It's at sittisoap.com/pages/impact, and we'll put that in the notes later. But then also we're discussing impact from a broader perspective as well. We thought this would be a great time to discuss impact from the perspective of measurement and evaluation and reporting and learning. How do we think about impact from a social enterprise perspective, but also from the perspective of other stakeholders in our sphere, right? And we have Dima Alashram here today to talk with us. She is incredibly intelligent person on this topic, and we're really fortunate to have her here. She's also a member of our International Advisory Board. So I'm going to start off first with some quick introductions around the table, so we can remind everybody of who we are if you haven't listened to or seen an episode of Sips with SITTI. My name is Jacqueline Sophia. I am a co-founder of SITTI, and I am also head of our impact. And yeah, Noora, do you want to go ahead?
And I'm Noora Shrab. I'm also one of the co-founders at SITTI, and I'm a team member.
You're a CEO.
Yeah. I have a really hard time saying it out loud. When I tell people, I'm like, I find it really obnoxious to say sometimes. So forgive me if I didn't say it right away. And and I'm really, really glad to have Dima here on this revival of the Sips with SITTI for this season.
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, Noora. It's always a pleasure to speak with you. And whether it's on the International Advisory Board or an informal chat like this one, I always find it fun speaking with you and thinking through impact concepts and ideas with the SITTI team. Yeah, maybe I'll talk a little bit about why I'm here. I know, Jackie and Noora, when you reached out, you wanted to discuss impact and what it means for different organizations. And I was lucky enough to ask that question across the 12 years I've been doing this, whether it's in impact management or ESG/sustainability consulting. And I think for all these years, I think the questions and the answers differ depending on what sectors we work in and what kind of setup and what kind of stakeholders and beneficiaries we are working with. But this is something that I would love to discuss more in detail with you today and answer any questions you might have around the different applications of impact measurement and management.
Yeah, so tell us, I guess first start off, Dima, a little bit about yourself, where you got started in your career, and because I know there's a little bit of a connection with Jordan and a nonprofit that we actually knew of collectively and worked with or at different times. So would love to hear your story and how kind of you've evolved since Jordan.
Yeah, so actually working in Jordan, that was my very first job, just right out of grad school. And everyone asks me, how did you end up in impact and ESG and sustainability management? And no one has a perfectly crafted, well-planned story. Sometimes you just stumble and end up in certain places. So I was in grad school studying public administration, actually. but my focus was on nonprofit management. So naturally, I wanted to work for a nonprofit when I first graduated. So I went back to Amman, Jordan, and I joined a nonprofit organization called Ruwad. This was basically, at the time, the CSR arm, a term that we're slowly seeing disappear, but sort of the social investment arm of Aramex, a Middle East-based logistics company and shipping company. So it was a really unique partnership between the private and the nonprofit sector in Jordan, where we see the private sector giving back to local communities and investing in the well-being and growth and development of local communities. So I joined this NGO as an operations manager, and I think I get to see early on in my career firsthand how difficult and nuanced impact assessment is. It means everything, and it could mean nothing if not understood correctly. And how agile you have to be in addressing challenges to impact measurement, especially when you're working with different communities, different stakeholder groups, and then you have reporting requirements from the private sector and expectations to learn about what's happening on the ground. After a couple of years with Ruwad, I actually joined Aramex, which was the organization who created, or one of the companies that created and funded this NGO. And I transitioned slowly from impact measurement and management on the social side of things to looking more into sustainability as a whole. What does it mean to become an environmentally and socially and even governance-wise responsible organization? So part of my role was responsible for continuing the relationship with the nonprofits we were supporting and partnering with, but also taking more of a corporate role in terms of looking at the company's environmental and social and governance responsibility, or otherwise known as sustainability. From there, I then transitioned more into consulting. So working with corporates, investors, SMEs, even nonprofits on understanding their ESG and sustainability strategies, reporting, stakeholder engagement, etc. And this fast forward, after a few years, I ended up co-founding Tidal Impact with my two other partners. And we sort of gathered our expertise together to right now serve our clients in our advisory capacity, advising on ESG, sustainability, and impact measurement and management practices.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. And yeah, I think you're right. We definitely tend to see a lot of that and experience a lot of that kind of falling into a certain field or area of interest. You definitely don't always start out where you think you're going to end up. But I was wondering first if you can, just shed some light on the kind of the evolution you've seen and the expanding array of standards and frameworks and tools for impact measurement and reporting over your career, but also kind of what you're observing now, because like you said, things have sped up a bit in the past few years. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And again, the answer really differs depending on what sector we're looking at. So for example, if we're looking at the nonprofit sector or social enterprises, any organization that was really started with a commitment to creating deep impact, social or environmental impact, then impact measurement, reporting, tools, frameworks, and standards have really existed for a very long time. If we're looking at maybe more the corporate sector, so for-profit organizations, investors, the conversation is evolving and becoming more sophisticated. It has been becoming more sophisticated in the past few years. When we look at nonprofit organizations, we see that impact measurement models have always existed in a very detailed way, because basically this is the only way a nonprofit can get its money and report back to its donors and grantors. You have to provide very detailed reporting, account for almost every penny that's being spent. Otherwise, you don't get funded again. We don't see the same story when it comes to the private sector. So it's really, again, I don't like to generalize because it depends on the mission and the focus of the for-profit organization we're talking about. But if we're talking about, let's say, a typical corporate that's into manufacturing or services, more recently, we've been seeing on the advisory side, clients coming to us and saying, look, we do all this work with the local community, or we do all this work with our employees, and we want to understand what is the impact of this work so that we are able to decide whether we continue a certain program, do we keep growing it, funding it, or do we kill it and focus on something else? So the why are we doing things, the question of why is starting to come up a lot. And we're seeing more demand for sophistication. So basically not just measuring outputs. So it's not just a number of people who attended a training, but it's more of like what happened as a result of people attending this training. Instead of companies saying we donated X amount of dollars to our local NGOs, they're trying to think of what is the impact of that dollar on the beneficiaries of those NGOs. So it's more, there's more sophistication on regarding the why, and also the how. How do we measure data, and how do we report, and how do we tell an impactful story? So that's part of the evolution that we've been seeing, in addition to an emergence of endless standards, frameworks, and this is coming from a deep need for standardization. I think everyone in the impact community and the sustainability and ESG community, for that matter, is really hungry for standardization. ESG and sustainability has been witnessing a lot more of that. So we're seeing standards that have been there and frameworks that have been there for maybe even as much as 20, 25 years. And then now we're starting to witness the convergence of a lot of these standards. We're not, the impact world is still not there yet. So we still have a lot of different impact frameworks and standards that are more similar than different, I would say, but there isn't still one global consensus on what is the best impact measurement standard. And there are many reasons why, but one of the main ones is because impact is very nuanced, and sometimes when we try to standardize it, we almost lose some of the impact by doing so.
No, that's a really, really good point, especially around the point of like, what's the point? Why does it matter? Really, really diving deep where companies are spending so much money, but not really knowing the long-term effect of that. So I want to ask you, if a social enterprise is starting from zero, like they've never done impact measurement before, they want to start, taking a hit at it, what's the best place to begin on developing a practice of monitoring and evaluating your impact? Because sometimes it seems overwhelming and scary to just take that first step. So what would you recommend?
Yeah, and this is a question we get a lot. Where do we start? How do we know that we're not doing too much at the beginning or doing too little to the point that it doesn't matter? I like to begin with benchmarking. And this is as simple as identifying who are your peers or industry leaders that you look up to and usually turn to for your normal day-to-day activities. And this goes, by the way, for anyone, not just social enterprises, even if it's a corporate, even if it's an investor, whether they're an impact investor or a traditional investor, we have the same advice. Start by benchmarking your peers. And this is done by looking at what kind of what kind of impact language do they put out to the world? Do they have impact reports? Do they have strategies? Do they have policies? Or maybe opinion pieces, white papers? And this is what we begin by doing, by looking at different impact reports. If we're lucky and they're available, they can tell us a lot. I mean, SITTI, you just produced your impact report. If someone who considers SITTI a peer, that would be a starting point. And through the peer benchmark analysis, we're able to tell a few things. We can tell whether certain organizations in our peer group are using specific frameworks, standards, or processes. We can also see what kind of specific metrics and disclosures and KPIs and targets they have in place. And this sort of gives us some signals on whether our own targets are ambitious enough or not ambitious enough, or maybe too unrealistic. It also gives us a better idea of how our peers engage their stakeholders. What kind of communication channels do they have with them, and in what frequency, and what kind of feedback do they gather? So the benchmark analysis is a really starting point, because it also sparks a lot of ideas. What is the market expecting from us, or what is the stakeholder group expecting from us in terms of what we communicate publicly about impact as well? So it gives us a little bit of homework on what we can do internally, and then what we can communicate externally. The next step after benchmarking is always stakeholder engagement. And this is something that I think the Global Reporting Initiative, which is an ESG reporting standard, has done really well, defining sort of best practices for stakeholder engagement. And we want to do this because we want to make sure that any impact framework, process, or policy that we come up with is not going to be separate from what the stakeholders expect us to do. I think one question that always comes up at this stage is, how do we engage the stakeholders? Who do we engage? How many do we engage? Should it be a representative sample? I mean, ideally that would be great, but stakeholder engagement to define the topics that we want to focus on, which is also called materiality analysis. It's a term borrowed from accounting standards. How do we define material topics, the topics that are of most importance to us, priority topics? Well, we need stakeholders' opinions, and it's more of an art rather than a science. As long as we have a few representative voices from each stakeholder group, then we're good. And I'm a big fan of using both qualitative and quantitative methods. So surveys, good old surveys, give us a lot of insights, and then maybe picking a few people who took the surveys and interviewing them one-on-one to get deeper. That's when we get a lot more narrative context and explaining why people chose certain topics to highlight or give more importance to certain topics versus the others. After the stakeholder engagement, which is the second step, we can then go into developing the theory of change, which is, why are you doing what you want to do? The theory of change, or something similar, is the logic model. It's basically saying, what do we want to do? How do we want to do it? To create what? So what are the inputs? What is the process? And what are the outputs on the short term? And then what are the outcomes on the long term? From there, the technical work can begin by setting baseline data, using baseline research, and then developing the framework, etc. But yeah, if I were to summarize the starting points, I would say peer benchmark analysis, stakeholder engagement, development of the theory of change, and then jumping into research.
And okay, so, you know, say an organization goes through this whole process and they determine, okay, this is the framework we're going to use to monitor and evaluate our impact. But say 2 or 3 years down the line, things change, right? Your stakeholders, you know, might change from one group to another, or they might, you know, expand. And so what, sorry, I'm throwing a little bit of a curveball question here at you, but what do you suggest in that scenario? Because there must be some sort of an iterative process to this, you know, to developing a practice around monitoring and evaluation as well, right? Like you can't, I mean, I'm assuming, right, you can't have just a static approach to it year after year after year.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So there are multiple elements that we're talking about here. There's the formulation of an impact framework, for which the steps I mentioned before, they eventually help you come up with an impact framework. And this is something that companies can do maybe once every 2 to 3 years and refresh it on an annual basis. But then the engine that keeps the impact framework going and being sort of executed on the ground is the monitoring and evaluation practice. And this is a practice that's always done on a daily basis. It becomes part of the core operations, especially for a social enterprise. Whether the impact framework has to be revisited, ideally it has to be reviewed annually at least, or whether big changes happen to the organization, an expansion into new geographies, an expansion in the types of services or programs offered, a change in the stakeholder or the beneficiary group, obviously will trigger changes. So the impact framework is not really a static document. It's not as static as a policy, for example. It's actually a living, working document that you always go and iterate. And this is why I'm a big fan of having the impact framework on an Excel sheet, because you can, the minute it's on Excel, you know, you can go and edit as much as you want. It's not a nice laminated document or a static PDF. Maybe some of the statements, like, you know, our theory of change can stay for a couple of years and become a little bit more static. But in terms of who are we affecting, the 5 dimensions of impact: what impact are we creating, how are we creating it, who's being impacted, how much impact are we creating, what are the risks? These are all questions that we should be asking as we do our daily work.
Thank you, Dima. What would you say would be the challenges, or I would say like a pitfall that an organization falls into when they start measuring their impact when they try to report on it? I mean, what are some of the major mistakes that you're like, oh, why did they do that? Or, you know, that's, you know, not something that you would recommend. What would you say?
Yeah, I mean, the challenges really differ based on the type of client we're working with, and the phase we're at. Some of the challenges, let's say, if we're early on, still in the formulation phase of creating an impact framework for a client, sometimes the peer benchmark analysis maybe is not informative enough. Maybe we chose peers that let's say we're working with a corporate instead of a social enterprise. We looked at some corporate examples with absolutely no impact material, no impact reporting, and we didn't have anything to compare and benchmark with. Sometimes organizations can look at peers who are not really peers. Maybe they are in some aspects of their business, but not in terms of the impact that they wish to create. But I would say that the biggest challenge in impact measurement and management overall across clients is the practicality of getting the impact data. So an organization, let's say a social enterprise like SITTI, can spend a lot of time coming up with the metrics and articulate them very clearly, but then getting data to measure these metrics could be a challenge. And this can be for different reasons across different sectors. For some social enterprises, usually maybe there's a challenge on reaching people on the ground to gather data and to make sure that this data is accurate. So there's a clear understanding of what data needs to be gathered. It's just the process of gathering it. Do we send people surveys? Do we interview people? Are we collecting numbers only? Are we collecting anecdotal evidence? And how do we know sometimes when we're not telling half of the story if we're over quantifying and turning everything into a number? Sometimes you can, for example, capture the number of women who attended let's say soap making workshop, but is that really the impact? What about unintended impact of women coming together, building social connections, building a sense of community, having the feeling that they did meaningful, important work? Sometimes we don't have the right KPIs to capture that. And even when we do, how do we make sure that we have the right touch points to collect that data where the impact is taking place at the right time? So I think I touched upon multiple things. So formulation of the impact KPIs is one challenge. Getting actual data for these KPIs is another challenge. Another key challenge is sometimes trying to do too much too soon. Because you can get sort of like death by reporting and death by collecting a lot of data. And this is why with smaller organizations, we really urge them to focus on materiality. What matters the most? The why are we doing this work? Why do we collect this data? What's our core focus? What is the impact that we're looking to create in the first 3 to 5 years, and then 7 to 10 years, and then 10 years plus?
And that looks different. Yeah, that
soon.
looks different for every organization, right? Like that's not something that is a cookie cutter formula for everybody. It's really something that you have to internally dive about. Okay, what is it that we're trying to extract? Why are we collecting this data? But even from a challenging perspective, especially with everybody sharing things on social media about impact, do you find that there's companies fall also in the trap of trying to get too trendy with certain metrics that are really not relevant to them?
Yeah, absolutely. Like everything, the impact management world goes through trends. Right now, obviously, well, I don't mean to say a trend in a negative sense, but right now the focus globally is on environmental impact. And this is, of course, something that is a global priority. However, does that mean that every social enterprise has to focus all its efforts on measuring emissions? Well, maybe not. Maybe it depends on what kind of work you're focused on. Let's give an example for corporates. Sometimes a company that comes to us that's a small team of maybe, I don't know, 20, 50 employees focuses on the services sector, and they're really focused on measuring their environmental emissions. It's very easy to calculate. However, this is not where your positive or negative environmental, negative or positive impact lies, because your carbon footprint as a small office that maybe half of the team works from home is not going to be as massive as a manufacturing organization or a shipping organization when it comes to carbon emissions. So maybe it's trendy, but you have to report and measure and evaluate the areas where you are able to create the most positive impact, or the areas where you can create, you have the biggest social and environmental risks. So not focusing on what's trendy and focusing on what matters to you is definitely another area that we see companies might feel challenged with.
What are some of the other common challenges you're seeing from some of your client base as they're gathering data and trying to engage their stakeholders in that process?
Yeah, another challenge could be related to reaching out to different players in your value chain or your supply chain. We notice sometimes you're able to gather data from your tier one stakeholders or suppliers. Let's say you're trying to understand human rights considerations in your supply chain, or you want to make sure that everyone you work with is paying acceptable either minimum wages or living wages, and that everyone is treated fairly. You might be able to get this data from your largest suppliers because they have an interest in answering your questions and serving you. But then as we go further down through the supply chain, this becomes more and more challenging as you have 2 or 3 points of separation with different suppliers. So how can we create enough interest, and how can we use our leverage to gather this kind of information across the supply chain? And this is a major risk area for different industries, but it's a major risk area, let's say in manufacturing, in retail and fashion, because then if there's any room for negative impact, it gets passed on from supplier to supplier down the supply chain.
Yeah, I think we've seen that with what was the brand recently that had a lot of criticism around it? I think Shein was experiencing a lot of blowback because there was unreported or a lack of research around their supply chain, and ended up being a lot more injustices that were revealed that they either didn't know about or were not, or choosing not to report on down the supply chain. So, yeah. Yeah. And so I guess, with larger corporates, with big brands, SITTI right now, right, we're providing impact reporting as part of our brand partnerships. We did this with Law C10 recently in the Middle East. And, I think, we as SITTI can talk about this all day, but from your perspective, Dima, working, out in the larger ecosystem of impact reporting, why should big brands or major corporate and luxury brands be paying more attention to the impact reporting coming out of the social enterprise space? What's the benefit, for them to keep their finger on the pulse?
Yeah, this is an important question. I think corporates are becoming more and more aware and more responsible. It's no longer interesting to just donate money and call it a day. They want to understand how can we become partners? How can we become long-term partners that understand the impact that we're creating, instead of just donating money to a social enterprise or a nonprofit and let them deal with it. And this is driven by multiple factors. It could be that the customers of that brand are demanding more of their brand than just focusing on financial growth. They're demanding transparency. They're demanding to see what kind of partnerships these corporates are making to improve social and environmental conditions of the communities they operate in. And as a result, these corporates are becoming more sophisticated in communicating their sustainability, because they understand that sustainable factors like environmental and social and governance factors, once they're addressed, it's really a strong risk mitigation process that helps you prosper and grow and basically continue to thrive. So from that lens, corporates are looking for partnerships with social enterprises or nonprofits that can understand that and can provide the sophisticated reporting and engagement that they're looking for. So it really goes back to alignment. If I'm a corporate and I've aligned with specific sustainable development goals, the SDGs that were developed by the United Nations, and then I'm able to find partners on the ground that help me report and measure how I'm contributing to these SDGs, or just any impact goals that I have, then it makes my job as a corporate much easier, because I have a partner that understands that it's no longer enough for them to send me a PowerPoint with beautiful images and inspiring visuals. We actually need backed data to tell our story. And then corporates find that useful for their own communication as well, and for their own annual reporting, whether they go for impact reporting or sustainability or ESG reporting. And it basically makes their impact story more compelling once it's backed by data and once it's backed by case studies. And they will naturally gravitate to these organizations versus organizations that don't give them back this data.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, the second piece to that you mentioned, the compelling stories, I think it's also the fact that you're able to be accountable to the people that you're impacting at the end of the day, like the actual human beings behind those numbers. And you can, there's more transparency in that kind of a relationship, which, you know, we always appreciate, because for us, it's like our impact reporting really is centered around the stories of the community members that we work with every day. And that is always important. And like, that's paramount to us, you know, these people, at the end of the day, they have names, they have families, they have lives. And I think a lot of the times the numbers are absolutely important from a measurement perspective and from a, you know, being able to measure progress. But progress is also measured in the individual stories of people who can speak to their own lived experiences and how they've taken it upon themselves in a lot of ways to work with social enterprises like us in order to, you know, gain self-reliance or work towards more self-reliance.
I think also too, Jackie, just to add on that, is that we don't often see progress happening overnight. It's something that often takes years in the making. There's a lot of, you know, back and forth, the relationship building, the community building, and the development. It's hard to measure that when you're just throwing some money to a community and being like, all right, good luck, see you later. Whereas where social enterprises are kind of knee deep, working closely with the community, asking them, you know, what, you know, creating or doing needs assessments and understanding, okay, what are some of the fundamental needs that are that you're looking for? Because it may not just be one-ended. We may feel like, okay, look, SITTI's creating employment on one end, but then there's probably 5 other overarching issues that this community is facing that we're not even looking at and we're not even touching on. And a lot of the times when you have big corporations coming in to create these quick campaigns, that it is often deficient because it leaves a gap in, you know, bigger issues that are at hand, where, you know, they may have money to spend towards something very specific, but it really isn't at the core of what the community needs at the time, for example. And so working closely with, let's say, social enterprises that are on the ground that kind of have a better scope and understanding of what the community may be needing, or tracking, like you said, certain measurable qualitative and quantitative data around the impact on the ground, it provides a different perspective aside from, like, you know, what you may see from a bird's eye view of like, oh, look, they might create 5 jobs, but what does that really mean? Or what does that really mean when you're procuring from a community that could be, you know, that are refugees, or sourcing materials from a particular manufacturer? What's the long-term impact of that? And so I think when we're looking at conversations with corporates is there are big commitments that are made. And I think now we're seeing it, like you said, Dima, is like more and more consumers are holding them liable of saying, well, okay, are you really saying what you're saying you're going to do? Like, are you actually doing what you're saying you're doing? And that's kind of where corporates have that sense of responsibility to then create, whether it's partnerships or alliances with social enterprises, maybe even with nonprofits from a ESG perspective, impact perspective. So, but yeah.
Yeah, I think there's, and it really is such it can feel like a behemoth of a thing to, approach and take on impact measurement and reporting. And I think that, Dima, you've done a really good job of breaking it down for us. I'm really excited to start to distill these notes actually and share them with people, because I think a lot of, especially smaller organizations, nonprofits, even though it is, a nonprofit organization or social enterprise, it starts out with a very socially driven mission. There still is the really big question in the beginning of, okay, where do we begin? And how do we take this on in a very manageable way, but also in a way that's going to hold us accountable long term. And I think we're always trying to improve on that as SITTI. I think every year we look at our impact, and I think we see obvious room for improvement, but also it's also an opportunity, I think, for organizations to see how much they've grown and you actually worked with us to develop one of our impact measurement tools, which is our community impact partner impact sheet. And it's a very basic tool, kind of going to what you were saying about, well, you really have to kind of meet your stakeholders where they're at too, right? And for us, most of our stakeholders are these community-based organizations that don't necessarily have the access or the luxury to be using, certain technologies or certain applications that help kind of gather a wealth of data all the time on a monthly basis or a quarterly basis. So what we did was we created this community partner impact sheet, and it is an Excel document that measures certain indicators related to the UN SDGs and our overarching goals as an organization that we've established for ourselves, and looks at how do those indicators match up to what our partners are doing on the ground. And it also allows us to see where they might be having some sort of challenges or difficulties in reaching certain goals. For instance, gender equality. One of the indicators that we measure is the percentage of women in management positions, right? And that's something that we've noticed over time has slowly improved. But there still is, a ways to go in terms of the percentage of women you see in those management positions in comparison to the amount of women who are actually working with those organizations, right? So it's really allowed us to use this tool that's pretty accessible, right? It's in an accessible format. We use it on Google Drive in order to allow them to access it easily. And ultimately, we have our community impact team on the ground that is trained to support our partners in accessing the tool and filling it out and answering any questions they have. So kind of speaking to what you were saying earlier about how do these organizations reach their stakeholders at a local level and ensure that they're able to kind of collect that data and manage it on a regular basis. So yeah, this has all been really exciting. I'm curious, what kind of final thoughts or words would you have for people listening? I think, there's probably a few different audiences listening at this point, whether it's, investors, large corporates or social enterprises or small nonprofits like ourselves? What would you say to them?
Jackie, I think you said it really well. Meet your stakeholders where they're at. A lot of the clients that come to us think that the entire focus should be on the kind of KPIs that we create. And yes, of course, we have to be very meticulous and thoughtful in the impact KPIs, but then we also have to make sure that these KPIs can be measured and answered, and that the stakeholders are able to provide meaningful data. It's really not useful if we can come up with 100 very sophisticated benchmarkable indicators that no one has an answer to. So I would say start with something very accessible, and start with a gradual approach. Sometimes we work with clients and we develop really as little as 5 impact indicators, and we say consistency is right now more important than quantity of indicators that we come up with. Let's measure these 5 indicators consistently, and let's create a culture of measuring and talking about impact. Whether you're an investor looking to gather information from your portfolio of companies, or whether you're a corporate looking to gather impact indicators from nonprofit partners that you have, or if you're a social enterprise looking to gather information like SITTI from community-based organizations. Focus on accessible tools. Nothing is wrong with Excel. There are so many impact platforms out there, but while some of them are very easy to use, not everyone has, let's say, the technical know-how or the accessibility to use them. Start with a few indicators that matter the most, measure them consistently, and then make sure your stakeholders see the result of this data. Going back to the challenges question you had, Noora, sometimes we engage stakeholders in a heavy impact measurement exercise where we're asking them, interviewing, surveying them, and then they never see the result of that engagement, and they get really tired because all they see is annually or maybe even quarterly, they're asked all these questions, and then they never get to reap the results of what that led to. So sharing results, making sure everyone understands it's an iterative and evolving process is really helpful.
Yeah, I think one of the things I'm actually really excited about with the launch of our impact report is sharing it with our partners and sharing it with our stakeholders and saying, look, this is the impact that you were able to make. This is what we were able to achieve in the last 2 years. This is a way to reflect on the work that we're actually doing. So, I was like making a list, like, okay, I want to send it to this person and this person and this person, because it's an opportunity to showcase and understand, like you said, your day to day, and ask those questions. Ask those questions of why does it matter? Ask the questions of, are there things that in the future we missed when it comes to tracking, or are there questions that our stakeholders are having that we're like, oh, this is something that we never thought of, and also sharing those wins with the very community members that we work with and saying, look, this is, sometimes small successes or small steps towards achievement, particularly impact, because sometimes it takes a few years or, before you see change, whatever, that really means is, it's gradual. It's not something that often happens overnight. And being able to say, look, progress has been made, albeit it might be small or, small steps, but this is kind of what we're able to achieve in the long form. And that's I think the beauty of, and this is maybe like a wrap up note of, those that are interested in beginning to delve into impact reporting or just like measurement in general, is the beauty of it is looking back as well and saying like, oh, wow, we did that. Or, oh, like I didn't realize, like, you do your workshops, you do your retreats, you create, that form, but being able to kind of being like, I know our last impact report was based on the last 2 years, we weren't able to publish one right after. And so seeing the compilation of the 2 years, I was like, oh, wow, yeah, I forgot about that, like, it's really nice to have something there tangible
I
to
think,
then review and share.
and sometimes people get scared to measure their impact, I think, because they're worried they're going to find things out that, I mean, listen, it's not easy, right? This is the other thing. And at least from my perspective, every year, you know, we deploy 2 tools. We use our partner impact sheet, but we also work with the Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative to use the Self-Reliance Index. And you know, that's a whole nother episode and conversation.
It's a whole nother episode.
But one of the things that I've noticed about myself throughout the process and our team, even on the ground, is when you go to ask questions around what the impact has been in these, you know, various indicators over the years, it is a bit nerve-wracking because you are also holding yourself accountable to the goals that you've set forth for your organization and for your partners. And sometimes you don't meet your goal, or sometimes there is a decrease in the numbers, you know. I mean, for example, we saw increases in a lot of our objectives around gender equality. But we also saw a decrease in our community-based partners from 2021 to 2022. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's really an opportunity to, share those wins. And then also evaluate, okay, this is what we've done over the past year or 2 years. It allows you to take that step back and make the time to evaluate your progress and ensure that you're setting objectives for the next year based on where you landed as of today. And I think that, you know, for people who are looking at impact reporting and measurement around, you know, oh, it's too much for us to handle. It's a lot of time. It's too much from an investment standpoint. I would say you can't afford not to, because otherwise you'll find yourself going off in directions where, you know, you'll be way off the path. And impact reporting really allows you to, you know, refocus, stay on that path of your goals and objectives, or determine, are these the right objectives for us as an organization? So,
I think, Jackie, what you said now is key. If you think that you don't have time for impact measurement, then it means you're not measuring the right things. You're measuring nice to have things that are trendy, things that sound nice, but they don't impact the core of your operations. If you understand that what you're measuring is absolutely tied to your mission, then you can't afford not to measure it. It's actually part of your day-to-day. No business will tell you we're not measuring revenues, because they will cease to exist. And no NGO or social enterprise focused on supporting refugees is not looking at how many refugees are able to become more self-reliant, because that's their core mission. So if you measure what matters, then it's not going to be extra work. It's going to be work that you can't go on without.
Yeah, I like that. Measure what matters.
Measure what matters. That's a nice way to end.
That's a good way to end it. Thank you so much, Dima, for your time. And we know you are incredibly busy, and you have a lot of other things going on. So we really appreciate you taking the time today. And
my absolute pleasure. Always fun speaking with you guys.
Yeah, you too. I always feel like we come away from conversations with you knowing so much more than we came into knowing. So we really appreciate it. And just to let everybody know, we'll have a link to Title Impact on the YouTube channel here, but also on our website. People can check out what you're doing as of today. And we'll also have a link to our impact report. Our 2021-2022 impact report is going to be out and available for people on our website. It is a downloadable PDF, so you will be able to access that. Anything else, Noora, before we go?
No, the only, actually, I'd like to say, we want to hear from you. So if you've had a chance to download the impact report, please reach out to us. Tell us what you think. Tell us your feedback. It's something that we always love to receive. And so go ahead, download it, read. It's a hefty document, but it's a pleasurable, delightful read. And I also want to give a special shout out to Juliana Camargo, who is our special designer for the impact report. So just a big shout out for her as we end this beautiful chat. Thank you.
She made it a beautiful document. So thank you so much, everyone. And
thank you.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, Dima. We'll talk to you later.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.